All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty fundamental to Muslim life, Salat, the daily prayers.
Absolutely.
What we really want to do today is kind of go through all of this and see if we can pull out the most essential insights about Salat, what it is, why it matters, and how we can actually connect with it on a deeper level.
I think that's a great way to frame it because, sometimes when we talk about these ritual practices, especially if you're not familiar with them, you can kind of get lost in the details. But what we really want to do is try to get to that core.
Yeah, so let's start with the basics. Our sources here really emphasize how central Salat is. It's not just like, an optional thing. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, right up there with the core beliefs, giving to charity, fasting, making the pilgrimage.
Right.
And the Quran really lays this out in a very straightforward way.
Mm-hmm.
So in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is chapter 2, verse 43, it says, "Establish prayer, give zakah, and bow with those who bow." So you can see right away how prayer is connected to those other essential practices.
Yeah, I find it interesting that right from the beginning, you see this connection between the individual and the community.
Right.
Bow with those who bow.
Right.
So it's establishing that prayer is both a personal act of worship, but also something that binds you to a larger group.
Yeah, and there's another verse in Surah An-Nisa, which is chapter 4, verse 103, and that one says, "Prayer is enjoined upon the believers at fixed times." So that really gives you a sense of that regularity that's supposed to be part of it. These are specific times set aside for prayer.
Yeah, like it's a scheduled appointment.
Right, exactly. And one of your notes actually referenced a really powerful hadith from Tabarani, and this one really hit home. It says, "The first deed a person will be questioned about on the day of judgment is their prayer. If it is sound, the rest of their deeds will be sound. If it is flawed, the rest will be flawed." That puts a huge emphasis on, getting prayer.
It does, yeah. It suggests that the quality of your prayer is kind of a reflection of your overall state.
Mm-hmm.
So if your prayer is done with real presence and sincerity, it's more likely that the rest of your actions will also be sincere and, aligned with your values.
Okay, so let's talk about the spiritual significance of Salat. Why is it so important on a personal level? And the sources here describe it as like a direct link, a personal conversation almost with Allah.
Yeah.
And there's an Arabic term for that, right?
Munajat,
yeah. And Quran 20.14 really captures this beautifully. It talks about the importance of worshiping Allah and establishing prayer for His remembrance. So it's like setting aside this time to just remember and connect with the divine.
Yeah, I like that, that emphasis on remembrance, because it's not just about going through the motions. It's about actually bringing yourself back to that awareness of God's presence.
Right, and there's this really beautiful hadith from Sahih al-Bukhari 528 that says, "The 5 daily prayers erase sins as water removes dirt." So it's like this constant process of purification.
Yeah, that image of water washing away dirt is so powerful. And it really speaks to the idea that prayer can help us to cleanse ourselves from, the negative things that we accumulate throughout the day.
Yeah, and it's not just about the words that we say, right? The physical postures of prayer are also very meaningful.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So, you mentioned in your notes how prostration or sujood represents complete submission to Allah.
Yeah, it's that act of humility, putting your forehead on the ground in that position of complete surrender.
Right, and then you've got Quran 29.45 that says, "Indeed, prayer prevents one from immorality and wrongdoing." And this ties into the concept of taqwa, right, which is like God consciousness.
Yeah.
So when you're regularly engaging in prayer, it cultivates this awareness of God's presence, and that can really help to steer you away from harmful actions.
Right, it's constantly reminding you that you're not alone, that you're accountable.
Yeah, like a spiritual compass that you're checking in with 5 times a day. And one of your sources also quoted this really powerful hadith from Sahih Muslim that says, "Pray as if you see Allah, for if you don't see Him, He sees you." So it's really emphasizing, the importance of being present and sincere in your prayer, not just going through the motions.
Right, because it's about that internal connection, not just the external form.
Yeah, so how do we actually go about cultivating that sense of presence? How do we make our prayers more meaningful? Because I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and your sources actually offered some really practical advice on that.
Okay, so let's get into the practical stuff, because I think that's what a lot of people are looking for.
Sure. So one of the things that's emphasized is the importance of being punctual. Praying at the beginning of the prescribed time. There's even an Arabic term for it, abula, al-waqt.
Yeah, it's like showing up on time for that meeting with the divine, right?
Exactly. And, it's also helpful to use reminders, whether that's setting an alarm on your phone or having a visual cue in your home, whatever works for you.
Yeah, whatever helps you to stay consistent, because that's really key, right?
Absolutely. And, in terms of actually deepening that connection during prayer, your sources talk about the importance of khushu, which is like focus or concentration.
Right.
And one really practical suggestion that you had in your notes was to try to understand the meaning of the recitations.
Yeah, especially Surah Al-Fatiha, right, which is the opening chapter of the Quran.
Right, because if you know what the words mean, it's easier to really engage with them and connect with their message.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And before we even begin to pray, there's wudu, the ritual washing. Yeah.
And that's not just about physical cleanliness, although that's part of it. It's also about this mental and spiritual preparation, right?
Exactly. It's like a symbolic cleansing. You're washing away the distractions of the day and preparing to enter into this sacred space.
Yeah. And of course, we can't talk about Salat without mentioning the beauty of praying in congregation or Jama'ah.
Right, that's a big one.
There are actually Hadith from Sahih al-Bukhari 645 and Sahih Muslim 650 that say the reward for praying together is multiplied, something like 25 to 27 times greater than praying alone.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's a real emphasis on that communal aspect of worship.
Yeah, it really highlights that sense of unity and support, standing shoulder to shoulder with your brothers and sisters.
And speaking of creating that space for prayer, you also had a note about setting up a dedicated prayer space in your home.
Oh yeah, I think that's so helpful. Having a designated spot that's free from distractions can really help to create that sense of peace and focus. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the common misunderstandings about Salat that your sources help to clear up, because there's often a lot of confusion around these things.
Sure.
So one of the things that came up is this idea that praying at home is exactly the same as praying in congregation at the mosque. And while praying at home is definitely valid and sometimes necessary, the hadith that we mentioned earlier really emphasized the greater reward for praying together.
Right. And, there's also something really special about that collective energy.
Yeah.
When you're praying with a group of people, it can be really uplifting and inspiring.
Yeah, and another misconception that I think is important to address is the idea that women are somehow impure or, less than during their menstruation, and that they're not supposed to pray because of that. And your sources made it really clear that that's not the case.
Yeah, it's actually an act of mercy and consideration.
Yeah.
So recognizing the natural cycles of a woman's body and saying, you don't have to pray during this time.
Right. It's not about being dirty or anything like that.
Exactly.
There's also this misconception that if you miss a prayer, you can just easily make it up later. And while Islam does provide a way to make up missed prayers through qada, your sources really emphasize that this shouldn't be taken lightly. You shouldn't just intentionally skip prayers.
Right. It's important to try your best to be consistent and make prayer a priority in your life.
And finally, I think it's really important to emphasize that Salat is so much more than just a set of rituals that you go through. It's about connecting with Allah from the heart, with sincerity and presence.
Absolutely. It's about that inner transformation that comes from engaging in prayer with mindfulness and intention.
So how does Salat really fit into our daily lives and the larger Muslim community?
Well, one of the things that's really interesting is how the fixed prayer times actually help to instill a sense of discipline. It's like you're pausing your worldly activities 5 times a day to reconnect with something greater.
Right. It's like building that spiritual muscle.
Yeah, and that discipline can really spill over into other areas of your life.
Right.
It can help you to be more organized, to manage your time better, and to really focus on what's important.
Yeah, and we've already talked about the importance of congregational prayer, but I think it's worth emphasizing again how it really brings people together. It breaks down social barriers and creates the sense of unity and support.
Right. You might have a CEO praying next to a laborer, and in that moment, they're just equals, united in their devotion to God.
Yeah, and your notes also mention how the principles that we learn in prayer, like honesty, mindfulness, humility, those should really extend to all areas of our lives,
Absolutely. It's about taking those values that we cultivate during prayer and applying them to our interactions with others, to our decision-making, to our everyday actions.
Yeah, and speaking of passing on these values, your sources also talked about the importance of teaching children to pray from a young age.
Right. There's actually a hadith from Sunan Abi Dawud 495 that encourages parents to start training their children in prayer from the age of 7.
So it's about establishing that foundation early on.
Exactly.
And what about dua, supplication? Because your sources really highlighted the importance of making dua after we finish the formal prayer.
Yeah, there's a hadith from Sunan al-Tirmidhi that says dua is worship. So it's like this continuation of that conversation with God. You're asking for guidance, for forgiveness, for blessings.
Right. And your notes also talked about the value of having accountability partners, people who can support you and encourage you in your prayer practice.
Yeah, because sometimes it can be helpful to have that extra bit of motivation and support, especially if you're struggling.
Right. And for those who are really looking to deepen their connection with prayer, your sources offered some advice on how to strive for continuous improvement. So one of the things that they emphasized is the importance of continuously learning about the rulings or the fifth of prayer.
Right, because it's important to make sure that you're performing the prayer correctly and that it's valid.
Yeah, and your notes also suggested setting goals, maybe like weekly goals, to incorporate some of the voluntary prayers like tahajjud, which is the night prayer, and duha, which is the mid-morning prayer.
Yeah, those are great ways to, go above and beyond the obligatory prayers and really deepen your spiritual practice.
And finally, they emphasize the importance of reflection after you finish the prayer. Taking a moment to really connect with the feelings and insights that came up during that time.
Right, it's about savoring that connection and allowing it to really sink in.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that Salat is so much more than just a religious duty. It's a source of spiritual nourishment. It's a way to cultivate discipline and mindfulness. It's a powerful force for community building, and it's a path to connect with something greater than ourselves.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
And for you listening, here's something to think about. We've talked about a lot of practical suggestions today, so I'd encourage you to pick just one. Maybe it's focusing on the meaning of Surah Al-Fatiha during your prayer, or maybe it's making a conscious effort to pray at the earliest possible time and see how that impacts your experience. See how it deepens your connection.
I think that's a great challenge.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be limited to prayer. If there's any other practice in your life that you consider to be spiritual or meaningful, how can you bring more intention and mindfulness to that practice?
I think that's a great takeaway.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Salat.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time.